Hello, people of Speck&Tech.
Can you hear us? Can you hear us from right there? Yeah? Fede? Alza un attimo.
Dicono di alzare un pochino il volume.
Oh. Can you hear us there?
Alzo the
Yeah,
volume.
okay, cool. Okay, welcome to the 27th event of Speck&Tech. Actually, it's named Open Source. Guess what is the theme tonight? And
It's probably design.
yeah.
Thank you for laughing. Thank you very much. Yeah, I was trying so hard.
It's actually a special event because it's in partnership with MUSE, and a lot of people here in the front, the first rows are from UK and Portugal.
Welcome.
Who's from the UK? Hi.
Ciao, Simon.
Who's from Portugal? Obrigado. And the rest from Italy, right? You also learned some stuff, yeah? Cool, so...
we also have Justin from the US,
Yeah.
I guess, somewhere.
Yeah.
Ciao, Justin.
Somebody else from other countries, no?
Finland.
Spain. Sorry? Slovakia.
Slovakia.
Netherlands.
And the Netherlands, yeah. So,
Cool. No remote to go tonight. There's a Russian over there, right?
yeah, if I remember right. Ciao.
Cool. Okay, enough. There's a bunch of people behind Speck&Tech, people that work every day and night, weekends and stuff to make this happening. And actually we are a bit tired because we just came back from the mountains. Who was there? Yay.
Yeah, basically Speck&Tech is becoming like a cult or something. We're making more and more events until you end up being eaten by Speck&Tech. This is our master plan. Yes.
Anyway, it was an awesome weekend, just from last Friday till Sunday, in the beautiful Val di Sole, or aka Valley of the Sun, and you can see why. And yeah, I don't know what we did, just basically eating, relaxing, chilling, sauna, swimming, cliffhanger.
It's a hard life.
Yeah, a bunch of stuff. Really a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. We had to organize all the stuff.
Anyway, getting back to serious stuff. First speaker of the night, just sitting down there. Hi!
Simon PHIPPS.
Simon PHIPPS. A big applause for him.
He's coming anyway. Yeah, we still
there's a seat here in the first row.
Boring slides. So.
Okay.
I don't want to get in Lucas' way.
Okay. You might stay there for the rest of your life.
I might, yeah. I'm getting too old to stand up now.
Come on.
Second speaker for the night, Stefano from Paris.
Come later, no worries. Also, if you want to sit here, it's okay. You know, it's kind of, it's taste, so.
Cool. Right before starting, we have to thank a lot our supporters, and the first one for tonight is MUSE for making this possible, for bringing one speaker from the UK, or US, or somewhere in between.
Somewhere is his current location.
Yeah, and another guy from Paris. So I would say we call Manuel on stage to say a few words about MUSE, and a big applause for him.
Thank you very much. Yes, I come from MUSE. I'm Manuel. I'm a science communicator there. And yes, I want to thank to Speck&Tech for this opportunity. And when I heard from this name, I really can see that Speck&Tech is exactly what we mean now at MUSE for science communication, because we are really involved in sustainability, and Speck is something we can think if we are local, while tech is something we can do if we are global. So we are local and global, all connected in the floor of our museum and also in what we are doing now. But the question is, if tonight we are going to speak about something that is sustainability or not. Because probably when you say sustainability to you, you can think to environmental pollution or air quality or, yes, I don't know, biodiversity and something like this. But something has changed, because now sustainability needs our hands. I have just two. Can you bring me your hand? Yes, thank you. Need our hands to explain what is sustainability, because we use the United Nations new frame that is called the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17, and they are concerned the people, so your first finger, and then the prosperity, so probably you all are involved here, and then planet, of course, we are on the Earth, and then peace and partnership, and we are doing something like that. Okay, so probably yes, we all are involved in sustainability much more than we usually thought, and since our museum is a museum of science, museum of future, we, my colleague, are waiting for you, and we are just looking for space for discuss about sustainability. Since we are not just a museum for children, we are waiting for you over there. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Also for bringing a lot of people tonight. It's quite a proud place. Huh?
This Lego looks weird, yeah?
Yeah, it says not Lego on it.
Okay. Thank you, Manuel. And just straight to the second speaker for the night, or the second introduction for the night. Oh yeah, here it is. Hi, Luca. So the event is actually sponsored by IDM SÜDTIROL, ALTO ADIGE, and they're actually giving us support for getting the beers and the Speck of the night, especially because they have a great cause, which is open source. So I leave the word to you.
Thank you, Francesco, and thank you, Giulio. I'm Luca Miotto. I'm from IDM SÜDTIROL ALTO ADIGE, in particular for the Department of Ecosystem, ICT and Automation. We are focusing on innovation and in information technologies. And in particular, our target is to make South Tyrol a smart green region. That means we focus on sustainability, as Manuel said before. And to do that, we want to have more and better innovative services for our citizens and for our guests, of course, because tourism is very important for us in our economic. And how we do that? We implement pilot projects on different topics, and on these projects we want local companies to collaborate together with innovation and research institutions like university, even from other countries. One example of this project is the Open Data Hub. SÜDTIROL is a project that was born last year, and we want to create a more easily accessible point for all the open data available in South Tyrol. And the aim is to make the life easier for our companies and for our startups to create new application and new services. One example of that is this portal, Mobility Meran Youth, that has been created in collaboration with the municipality of Meran. On this portal, for example, you can see as a citizen of Meran or as a tourist important data like real-time data of the position of the buses, for example, or the state of each charging station. If you have an electric car and you want to charge it and you don't know if the charging station is available or not, you can look at it and you see in real time. There's also information like the bike available in the rental station. So this is just an example of what we mean as innovative and smart services. Another things that we consider very important to reach all these goals is grown very strong communities of developers, of experts, and for that reason we organize every year a lot of events, and I want to introduce our next two big events that I think can be very interesting for you. The next one, the first one is the South Tyrol Free Software Conference that will be held in Bolzano the 16th of November. We will have 40 speakers maybe, a main track in the morning and 4 parallel tracks in the afternoon. The keynote speaker this year will be Josh Simmons, that is the manager of the open source program at Google US. And other speaker, very important speaker, will be Chris Lamb, that is lead project of Debian. And all the information are available on our website, sfescon.it. And the other events that I want to present is the Vertical Innovation Hackathon. We organize it from nearly now 5 years. This is the 10th edition, this one. And the hackathon will start during the SFSCon on the 16th of November. It will last 24 hours. And you will compete to gain four prizes. The main one is the study trip in San Francisco, where you will be able to meet developers from companies like Google, Facebook, Wikimedia, and Twitter. And your guide in this trip will be our Simon PHIPPS. And all other information are available on our website, hackathon.bit.t. And both the events are free of charge. Both the events will be held in the Neutech Park. It's the new technology park built in Bolzano, and I kindly invite you to visit it because it's a really nice and interesting place, and it's also my working place. So thank you for your attention and enjoy the event, and see you in Bolzano.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I can't recommend enough both of the events. Also, I'm not speaking randomly. This is me at the previous Vertical Innovation, and this is Massimiliano.
That's also me, actually.
Huh? And also Francesco. So we are really speaking our mind. Yeah. We're not just giving space in exchange of guests. They are truly awesome events. And I can't recommend enough. Also, I'm very happy.
Julio is very honest, but he was the winner last year.
Yeah, of course.
And he went to San Francisco. So, like, guys, we are not like.
And Francesco, one of the previous year.
Yeah.
And
so you should just go there, and we will try not to be there and win it, of course.
we won't be there, I promise. It's not a participant.
Yeah, and the prizes are real. Like, you go to San Francisco.
Yeah, of course they're real. There's no bullshitting stuff on the stage. Alright, no, but really, they are both awesome events, and also very happy to bring Trento and Bolzano closer. Yeah. Something that politics can make, Speck&Tech can. Alright. Okay. Very powerful.
Let's move on. The sponsor of the night, the food will be provided by Poli. Usually it is segata, but then at some point after cutting hundreds and hundreds of kilos of speck, we were kind of tired, and actually it's better also for our safety reasons, because having a affettatrice
very interesting process, let's go on.
Cool. So, Impact Hub, Giulio?
Oh, yeah, Impact Hub is the place where we are. For those of you who don't know, which I guess is probably like a couple of people, it's a co-working space, so if you need a desk or an office for your project / startup / freelancing thing, this is the place you want to be in Trento, probably also the only one. They have honest prices, also there is a good community, so I really suggest it. Again, I'm here with my own office, so yeah. I'm speaking my mind.
And a discount for Speck&Tech as well. So then there's Spazierati, my company, Belka, Giulio's company. We have Fattura and Cloud, who are the guy providing us the receipt software for will you make the payments. So
yeah, basically when you make donation at the end.
If you make donation at the desk, you get an email from us saying thank you. And then we have Diginate, who are the guys printing out the stickers. And actually we had a number of editions of the stickers. If you go there at the desk and you make a donation, you can get as many as you want. And together with the stickers, we also have the t-shirts. So our second edition of the t-shirts, is somebody wearing them? Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Can you stand up, please, and show the people how cool you look? Yeah. Actually, that is very shy.
Actually, all the rest of us wore it at the weekend at the retreat. So
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, they're totally in the washing machine. And if you want, you can go on our website at speck&tech, and you can find all the sponsors, of course. You can also sponsor one of our events, and you find all the previous issues, where you find also the slides, the speakers, the bios, and the abstract of the talks, and also some interesting jobs if you are looking for a twist in your career. We invite you to follow us on Facebook or follow our social media.
Yeah, we prefer Telegram, to be honest. Facebook is dying, so who cares?
Yeah, but there's also Instagram. Yeah. And then, if you want to be
also
more active,
Instagram, which is the new Facebook. Yes, of course. All of them.
and if you want to be more active, you can also join us on Slack. Final question: do you have to donate?
Yes. If you want to keep Speck&Tech going, yes. Otherwise, don't. So we have like a clear feedback on how we are going. If you keep donating, things are good.
Yeah.
If you stop donating, we understand that we are boring.
Yeah. And we get all the leftovers and we go to Bahamas. So
Are we?
this is the main reason why you donate, because you get all the beers for free, all the spec for free, and also if you want to have some licenses of JetBrains, you can just go there at the desk and ask them, because we have a bunch. So you just go there and ask. Two more things before closing. First one, as always, for the questions, you can go to slide.do and insert code ST27. Everyone,
sorry, Francisco. For the new people here, this is the way of making questions. Like, since we don't like talking to people.
Yeah.
Basically, that's the main issue. Also, we want to let people that are looking online at the event to making questions. If you go to slide.do and write this code, you can ask questions, and the one that are most voted, they are read in front of everyone. So please don't write stupid stuff, because it will be read in front of everyone. We will point you, and you are the one. No, I'm joking.
and anyway, we'll send it also on the Telegram channel, so don't worry if you do not take any note down, but I'm sure many of you don't have Telegram, so it's pretty easy, the ST and the number of the event. Final point of the night, we are supporting this nice event by our friends at Google Developers Group in Trento, which is the DevFest. It's a network of events organized by Google, by local dev communities of Google all around the world, and there's one taking place in Trento. It's an interesting, okay, yeah, it has the date, so it's Saturday, 10th of November at C-Lab Trento.
Saturday.
If you go to devfest18.gdgtrento.it, you can find all the information. They have also some interesting speakers by Google. A call to action, you can go there and pre-register, or you can go there and say, I want to be one of the speakers, which is also cool, and it gives you some visibility and also some enthusiasm to bring back to the ecosystem.
Yeah, so if you don't have enough events from Speck&Tech in your life, you can also go to other events and just never be home again.
Yeah.
Like, if your parents, they're asking, where is my son? I don't know.
Yeah.
They went away many weeks ago.
And a few days after that day, there's going to be our next event. We don't know when yet. Nobody knows, actually, but there's going to be a Speck&Tech event towards...
I thought you were...
Yeah.
You knew it.
I guess...
Maybe
no.
Pietro. Pietro,
Somebody,
when is the next
yeah.
event?
Somebody knows when is the next event, but there's...
Giovanni?
Yeah.
Michele, no.
Yeah. No.
We have no idea.
Okay, yeah, we
Speck&Tech is collapsing, guys. So enjoy the last event of Speck&Tech, because this is going to be huge. So, alright, enough with the stupid stuff. Did you enjoy the introduction?
That's great.
Thank you, Simon.
Can we go on then?
So we've only got 5 minutes left now, so...
Yeah, so... You're dreaming of that.
So just out of interest, how many people here have won a hackathon up in Bolzano? Just raise a hand. I know there's more. I know there's quite a few of you here. So I know
Not one or participated.
No, well, no, one. You know, there's at least 6 of you. I know. No, there we go. That'll do. So look, I really need some more interesting people than this to take on the next tour, which is next May. So look, please come up on November the 16th and join the hackathon, so that I don't have to take these guys again.
We're not coming to the hackathon. It's not
No, I know you say that.
Well, I can say that there was also awesome food. Yeah, like best food they had at the hackathon.
Alright, so here we are.
There we go. I'll do it.
Should have everything set up.
Oh, maybe. I can start whenever you like. And we want the mirror. There we go. Okay.
Okay, are we ready?
Yeah, there's a point.
Okay, so warm applause to Simon PHIPPS that's traveling a long way, so making you feel home.
Thank you. Awesome. Goodness, you like this before beer. How's it going to be at the end? So, good evening. I am the adult supervision for the evening. So I'm Simon PHIPPS. I'm currently the president of the Open Source Initiative, and I would like to talk to you about open source. And I have a presentation here. Thank you. Oh, so exciting. I have a presentation here all about open source. So it's called, cryptically, 15 plus 20, what's next? Now, what does that mean? Well, open source is something which has been around now for 20 years. And so I've been on a world tour this year. There wasn't a t-shirt with all the venues on the back, but I've been on a world tour this year talking about open source to audiences all over the world for our birthday. And in most places they have birthday cake, but here you have Speck. So have you got candles to go in the top there? Yeah, okay. So open source did not just happen though. Open source came about because before open source there was free software. And actually free software is a bigger concept than you might think. There's two gentlemen up here. This is Richard Stallman, caught out of his native habitat. This was in the European Parliament, where he was giving evidence about software patents at a hearing. And this is Bill Joy. Bill Joy, starting from about 1978, was the lead developer on the Berkeley Systems Distribution, which was a distribution of the environment wrapped around AT&T Unix that gradually became a Unix distribution in its own right, called BSD. And these two gentlemen were really the pioneers of the free and open source software movement. Bill was over on the US West Coast creating BSD, and his basic philosophy was, we're doing all this cool stuff. Use it, do whatever you want with it, just don't bother me. And out of that came the BSD license that everyone knows, which embodies that principle of do whatever's cool but don't bother me. At the same time, over on the US East Coast, Richard Stallman was struggling with a new laser printer and discovering to his horror that the manufacturer had not supplied the source code to the printer driver and that he couldn't fix it. And out of that frustration, along a long winding road that involved a few other things, including the creator of Java in his earliest incarnation as a student working on Emacs, out of that came something called the Free Software Movement. And that's embodied in the GNU project, the Free Software Foundation, and the GNU General Public License. These two gentlemen need to be credited whenever you want to talk about free software, because neither of them alone created the environment that we have today. Together, they jointly created the understanding that we have of free software. And that was all good. That was 35 years ago that happened. The basic principle is something that Richard Stallman wrote down. He said that free software is software that gives you, the user, the freedom to share, to study, and to modify it. And that's called free software. And the existence of those freedoms is what many of us call software freedom. So software freedom was the watchword of a community of enthusiasts, many of them computer scientists, in days when there really was no public internet. To get hold of the software that Bill Joy and Richard Stallman were working on, you had to send a padded envelope and a magnetic tape and have the software copied onto the tape and sent to you. If you worked in a university laboratory, you might be lucky enough to have a network that ran fast enough and was well enough connected to get the software that way. But you probably were sending tapes around. And so the free software movement was a movement of these specialists, empowered by the freedoms to use, study, modify, and share software. Now, 20 years ago, that all changed. The internet became something that everybody could have. There began to be a commercial movement around software on the internet, and a company called Netscape tried to be a pioneer of business models in that world. They were driven out of business by Microsoft, and just before they hit the deck, they made their web browser into something that was licensed under a new free software license. As that happened, many people discovered that talking about free software was really very difficult with people who weren't from the world of software, and particularly with people who spoke English as a first language. If you say free to somebody who speaks English as their first language, their first thought is money. And consequently, if you talk about free software to people, you immediately have to explain, no, 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 I don't mean free as in price, I mean free as in freedom. And many of us felt this was a bad thing, that the first thing you had to do was reset the conversational frame. And so a group of people came up with a marketing campaign to talk about this pre-existing concept of free software using a new phrase, open source. A woman from outside the technology industry, Christine Peterson, was the one who suggested that phrase, and a group of well-known technology figures decided that was the perfect phrase to embody the marketing campaign for free software. And it's very important that we talk about freedom. In today's world, there are many people who want you to confuse freedom and commerce. And as you can see, this photograph was taken in New York. This is the New Jersey docks. And you can see all the cranes in the same posture as the Statue of Liberty, hoping that you'll confuse one for the other. Oh, and there goes my microphone. Okay, so open source as a marketing campaign did something really important. It let software users and software developers advance software freedom at work as well as in their private or research lives. And because of that, open source spread all over the world. And so I'm going to talk to you about those first 20 years of open source. In the first 10 years of open source, I would say that it was characterized by advocacy and controversy. By the beginning of that sequence, we established something called the Open Source Initiative, which I'm the president of. I'm actually not properly branded because this is the old t-shirt before we got the registered trademark. So I should put my finger over that so it's not misrepresenting it. OSI was formed to be the steward of the open source definition. And the open source definition is a set of objective, relatively objective rules for deciding whether a software license gives you the 4 freedoms or not. And by creating the open source definition and a public process for interpreting and expressing it, and then by having an organization that kept a record of which licenses passed the test, OSI was able to be the catalyst for this revolution that has occurred over the last 20 years. Here's the first 10 years for you. Lots of things happened. The open source definition was published in 1999. It was written by a gentleman called Bruce Perrins. Bruce was one of the earliest Debian project leads. Zach, who's going to speak to you after me, was one of his successors as Debian project lead. If ever you run into someone who's a Debian project, I'll embarrass him. If ever you run into someone who's a Debian project lead, they are Gandhi-like gods, because they are people who can make the Debian project think that they are smart and trustworthy. Anybody who can do that once is really great, and anyone who can do it twice deserves your worship. So remember that when Zach is speaking to you later. 2001, Microsoft worked out they had a problem. They decided Linux was a cancer to the software industry. In 2003, a company called Santa Cruz Operations, SCO, decided they would sue IBM for using Linux and for promoting Linux. That turned out to be a scam by some lawyers that ran for 20 years extracting money out of the legal system. But it carried on for a long time and was very upsetting. In 2004, we discovered that Microsoft wasn't just kidding when they said Linux was a cancer. They had actually got an active internal strategy to try and undermine and destroy it. And some other things happened. Unix became open source in 2005 when Sun Microsystems released Solaris as open source. In 2007, I had the privilege of making Java open source when I was working at Sun. And by the end of the decade, most people who were running computer operations in businesses had recognized that open source was something that was good for them. It was no longer a new phrase that had been invented in a small meeting at VA Linux. It was now something that was globally recognized by CIOs in pretty much every major country. So why did it succeed like that? What was it about open source that made it succeed? I'd suggest there were three things. There was what I call crystallization of consensus. There was the fact that it embodied a multilateral consensus, and the fact that it created safe spaces for collaboration. Let me explain those things. When I talk about crystallization of consensus, I'm referring to the process by which we decide that an open source license really is open source. Now that doesn't happen by somebody coming to me as OSI president and saying, here is our license, we would like you to tell the world it's open source. The way that happens is that the creator of a new open source license mails it to a public mailing list where everybody in the world can see it and comment on it. And, well, everybody does. And people get lots and lots of comments on their license on that mailing list. The process is happening right now. If you find what I'm saying boring, go look at the archives of license review at opensource.org, and you'll find there are two big conversations going on at the moment. In particular, MongoDB is asking to have its brand new license approved by OSI as open source. And the discussion is just beginning to get going on that. When the public discussion has got going, we expect people to improve their licenses. We expect people to listen to the comments and to iterate the license until the community agrees that it really is an open source license. When the discussion goes quiet, when it quiesces, OSI will then summarize the conversation, and the board of directors will take a vote on whether they believe that the license has been proven to be open source. And after that vote, then it gets added to the list of open source licenses. There's about 80 of them now. It's a few too many in my view, so please don't do it again. But that process embodies the consensus of the community. OSI is not the king of open source. OSI is more the speaker of the house of open source. We facilitate the discussion. We summarize the discussion. We remember the discussion took place. And by doing that, we end the argument about whether the license ever, is open source and whether the discussion ever happened. And because of that, developers can discover that the license has been approved, and they can confidently use it for their software. They no longer have to check with a lawyer and spend money locally. If you work for a corporation, you'll probably want to check with your lawyer before you use an open source license. But overall, this process made it much easier for people to do open source. Open source licenses are also very special. Licenses in business are typically bilateral. That means they're agreements between two parties. A license is actually like a truce in a war. It tells you that the war is over if you want it. And it tells you the areas where you're going to agree and not attack each other. Now, an open source license is not a bilateral document. It's a multilateral document. It embodies the consensus of the community about the freedoms that people need. It talks in the license about the style in which people will be able to use, study, improve, and share the software. And so licenses, according to Evan Moglen, are the constitutions of communities. They're the agreement, the ground of agreement between a community of people on how to collaborate. And consequently, they are very important, and they are also immutable. You cannot change them once the community has started using them without a great deal of effort and fuss and conversation. So open source licenses are the multilateral consensus of the permissions and norms that a community needs in order to collaborate. And that's the reason that open source licensing has led to communities that are so strong and so capable of creating great software. Because everyone knows that they have the rights they need to collaborate with each other. Everybody knows that they have the freedoms to exercise, to use the code for their own purposes, and to improve it so it works better for them, and to share their improvements with the community so that other people can benefit and make things better as well. Thirdly, creating safe spaces. Okay, and I won't read those bullets for you. I will jump straight in. there are a lot of control points in software. What I mean by control points are things that a business can decide to prevent you from having unless you pay. Those are control points. So copyright licenses are control points. Trademarks are control points. Patents are control points. If you're observant, you'll see I've built a brand new acronym here about intellectual property. So mitigating ownership of the control points is a key thing that open source licenses and communities do. Now, open source does not have business models. It's businesses that have business models. Open source communities collaborate on code, and then companies have business models. And if you get a big community together with many different companies involved, it's likely that their business models will conflict with each other. And so a very important thing that an open source project has to do is to protect the participants from each other. Create a safe space where my business model does not stop you succeeding with your business model. This is a fundamental role of an open source community. And it's the license that helps to make that happen, by guaranteeing that you have the freedom to use the software no matter who else is involved in the project. That you have the freedom to change it no matter who else is involved. That the fact that this company makes money by selling services doesn't mean that this company is not allowed to make money by selling services. So open source succeeded in part because it created a safe space for companies to collaborate by keeping apart their business interests and keeping them a safe distance from each other and taking their weapons away from them at the door, stopping them from having their patents in their back pockets waiting to shoot. So this is the reason that when you apply for license approval at OSI, we will not attempt to accommodate your business model. We're really not interested that you need this particular thing in your license to make your business model work. That's your problem. You're the one with the business model, the community is the one with the software, and the two shouldn't get mixed up with each other. Open source is about removing barriers. It's about making things work by giving permission in advance. And that's what's made open source work over the last 20 years, and particularly in the first 10 years, when it was new and refreshing for everybody. Yes, I'll let you read that later when you download the slides. There we go. So, second 10 years. So 2008, 2018. This goes faster, don't worry. A lot of enterprise adoption. We had some bad things happen, software patents. We had some strange things happen, GPL enforcement. So here's some highlights from the first decade. During the first decade, we saw that at the beginning of it, most companies were using open source. One of the things I used to do when I was at Sun Microsystems was go visit customers and ask them what their open source strategy was. And they'd say, we don't have an open source strategy. And I'd say, but what about all that open source software you're using? And they'd say, we don't have any open source software. And I'd say, so what's your web server running on then? And they'd go, oh. And we could go around the company and gradually show them that they were using a great deal of open source software, and maybe they needed to start thinking about it. By the end of the decade, open source software was at the heart of pretty much every piece of new software that was coming out. And if you look at pretty much anything new today, it will depend somehow on open source. Isaac Newton was said to have said that he was only great because he could stand on the shoulders of giants. Open source is like the step ladder that you use to get onto the shoulders of the giant. It's what gets you started rather than having to invent everything again. Even Microsoft has decided that it loves Linux now. It's no longer a cancer, and it is now fundamental to their Azure cloud hosting business, and consequently to everything in their future. And I actually believe that. So I've been along to speak with their staff, and I think they have genuinely got a new strategy. Motivated by profit, no doubt, but still they have a genuine strategy. And I think the things that will be a threat to open source in the future will probably come from other companies. Maybe over beer we can discuss which companies they are and what letter of the alphabet their name starts with. So lessons so far. Well, first of all, the rules have changed. Things are not the way they used to be. Software used to be the property of someone who let you use it in exchange for a fee. Nowadays, software is the property of someone or some group, and what they do is let you collaborate with them in order to use it. And they use an open source license to make that possible. Note that open source software isn't given away for free, rather the copyright is used as a lever to make you contribute, to make you collaborate, to make you share your improvements. Bill Joy, who I used to work with at Sun, said that the great truth is that you cannot hire all the smart people. It is inevitable that some of the smart people will work for someone else. And open source lets you work with all the smart people in a given sector, because they'll all be contributing to the project, even though they work for many different companies. Open source's real value is that it lets you innovate without asking. It lets you start from where somebody else reached rather than starting again. It lets you stay in control of your own resources rather than having to allow a vendor to take partial control. It lets you innovate and then have others maintain your innovation for you so that you can innovate some more. It lets you do things here in Trento that influence the economy over the entire world. It lets you do all those things and yet still be protected from all the other people doing the same thing. That's why open source succeeded. And, well, all of that comes from software freedom. All of those things that you want to do there come because you're guaranteed the right to use the software for any purpose, to study the software and understand it, to improve the software so it better meets your needs or the needs of someone you care about, and to share either the original software or the modified version with anyone you wish. All of those practical business values arise from these ethical values. And that's the reason open source and software freedom, open source and free software, are the same thing. Free software is what I talk about with you because you're my friends. Open source is what I talk about with business leaders because they're looking for economic value. But they're the same thing, just spoken about in different contexts, using different models. New things are only possible with open source. Let me suggest to you some examples. One of them is cloud. Cloud computing is only possible because of open source. If there was no open source, to do cloud, you would need to go and constantly check that you had enough licenses for the thing that's about to happen. When you had to scale in response to demand, when you had to split to 2 different geographies, when you had to move data between different geographies, you would constantly be checking if you had a license for that. You would constantly be checking if you had a spare license to run another instance. You don't have to do that though, because the software is all open source, and so you're free to use it for any purpose without asking for permission first. IoT, all those smart devices. By the way, smart, if ever you see it in front of the name of a thing, what that means is it's a security risk. That's what the S stands for in smart. But all of those IoT devices, their firmware is almost always open source because you can't possibly keep count of how many there are in order to pay the license fees or the royalties on all the units that you're shipping. The IoT revolution could not have happened without open source software. So what's going to happen in the 3rd decade? Well, we're squarely into the 3rd decade now because the birthday was in February. The 3rd decade. One of the things is OSI is changing. OSI has become a group of collaborating affiliates of many different kinds. You'll see some that you know, some that you don't know. We have Mozilla as an affiliate of OSI. We have the Linux Foundation as an affiliate. The Document Foundation is an affiliate. Creative Commons is an affiliate. all of these organizations have agreed to work together to make open source better. We are also now a member organization, so you can personally join and you can then participate in the election to decide who are going to be the leaders of the open source board. So you can, for example, get me off the board. Please get me off the board. Vote somebody else onto the board in place of me. Become a member and vote in the elections that are happening next March, please. What's coming? Well, I'm going to give you some predictions for what's coming next. For those of you who can't wait to the end, that's the answers. So the first thing that's changing is that the styles of community are changing. In the first decade of open source, everyone was looking out for the year of the Linux desktop. Maybe you had someone come to you and tell you you had to run Linux on your laptop, and telling you how you needed this new hobby of changing the device drivers every evening before you did anything. To be fair, that was how Windows was in those days as well. By the second decade of open source, people were less focused on end-user applications and more focused on open source parts, putting together solutions by aggregating open source parts, particularly for web applications. Now, for the third decade, I think we're going to discover that the cloud is now the desktop. And we need to start getting ourselves ready for that era, because software freedom is different when the cloud is the desktop. The year of the Linux desktop is actually here now. And I'm going to prove that to you. This computer I'm using down here is a Chromebook. And so I've been presenting to you with Google Docs. But if I switch over, this is the same presentation in LibreOffice running on the Linux kernel of the Chromebook. And because of the wonder of open standards, I can take the same presentation that is on Google Docs and I can run it on a desktop application. But it gets better than that, because also, if we click along here, this is LibreOffice Online. So this is LibreOffice running in a copy of the Chrome web browser. This is hosted on a server in Germany by the Document Foundation for me, because I'm on their board of directors. And it's got exactly the same functionality as the LibreOffice desktop application. And this is exactly the same file that I downloaded from Google Docs in ODF format that I'm able to use to present here. Now, the reason we were able to do this was because of the way that we coded the project at LibreOffice. LibreOffice is a model view controller application, and we were able to take the model part of LibreOffice and port it to many different platforms, and then write a new view so that the user interface could be used on a variety of different devices. So we now have an Android version of the LibreOffice model and controller, and a separate Android view that lets you have an Android document viewer. We have a version that runs on a server and serves up a tiled HTML5 view. What this means is that if you have got an application where you would like to embed spreadsheets or documents or presentations, you can simply use LibreOffice's model and controller and write your own view. You can build cloud applications that are custom for your purpose, but still collaborate with the open source community over the core of the code that implements the core of the functionality. This, I believe, is the direction that we need to take with applications in the cloud era. There's one other thing that we have to do, and that is to make sure that applications, as far as possible, are interoperable, that they use open standards, and that they use federated protocols. I believe the future of computing is one where we have coded for cloud freedom, where we haven't just let Google or Facebook or Microsoft be the big animal in the middle that we have to feed, but rather we have written applications that federate, applications that can be self-hosted, applications that can be customized by people who are working in community. So that there is still software freedom in the next decade like we've had in the previous three. So I ask you to do this. Code for cloud freedom, please. Make distributed applications that can be decentralized. Make cloud solutions that can be customized so that multiple business models can come together in open communities. and preferably build solutions that do both of those things, customizable and federated. Second thing that's going to change is how people do business around open source. In the first decade of open source, it was all about open source business models. All anyone could write about was open source business models. It was all about innovation in business models, using that free stuff to make money. It was kind of like the Bitcoin of its day. Now, in the second decade, things matured. People began to realize that business was about the production process. It was about gaining an advantage through being efficient or innovative in producing software. But I believe in the third decade, things are going to change. I don't think anyone will want single product businesses anymore. I believe we've seen MySQL AB, we have seen MongoDB. The future does not have companies like that in it. It instead has companies like Facebook and Twitter and Google who build software and create innovative open source as a byproduct of the rest of their integrated behavior. Open source today is about the complex assembly of simple parts that are gradually put together in order to make something that is unbelievable and beautiful, like this cascade of butterflies that I found in North America, and which sadly you won't be able to see on the study tour for the Bolzano Hackathon because they fly away in February. I'm sorry. But if you're going over there, I can tell you where they are. So in your business, in your school, in your university, create cultures of contribution. Because it's cultures of contribution that will create the next decade of open source. View intellectual property, if you must use that phrase, as something that should be leveraged to create collaboration, not as something that should be leveraged only by licensing for money. See open source and contribution as a way of having others maintain your innovation for you. Maybe that feels dishonest in some way, but if you contribute your innovation to the project, I assure you, people will show up to maintain it for you. And that means you don't have to anymore. You know, when I started programming for Unisys back in the 1980s, I worked on some COBOL code for a bank. And I spent the next 15 years in fear that the bank would somehow want me to come back and work on that code again, that they would discover it. And so I kept the mag tape in the bottom of my filing cabinet, just in case I ever had to go back to Nationwide Building Society and change the code that I worked on. Now, open source means never having to fear that you're going to get the call to maintain your 20-year-old code, because you donate it to the community and then the community maintains it for you. Isn't that beautiful? A culture of contribution also seeds the innovation of others. It's very important in open source that everybody can use the code for any purpose without asking for further permission. And one of the reasons that's important is they'll do things you never expected. They'll take that code and they will do a thing that you had never even believed was a thing, let alone was possible. They will take that little middle part of your code and they will embed it in a device, and they will collect data about your local transport service that allows people to find out where the buses are in your city. And it will all be because of that piece of code that you wrote and made open source that was in your banking system 15 years ago. Open source seeds innovation for others and allows the unknown others of the future to innovate in ways that you didn't expect. Third thing that's going to happen that I don't think will interest you quite so much is we're going to see fewer open source licenses. Unfortunately, OSI doesn't have a way of getting rid of unwanted ones. We never actually implemented garbage collection, which was a mistake. But today there are fewer and fewer open source licenses that matter. And I believe that that process will continue. The thing I would like to warn you about, though, is this third decade problem. In the second decade of open source, we discovered that license compliance in the GPL and other reciprocal licenses was a problem, and we started learning how to do it properly. But in the third decade of open source, where many small parts are being aggregated together, we're going to discover that actually attribution compliance is a problem as well. Remembering all the little scrappy parts that we have used and to thank the people that we got them from. Because you see, your use of the code is actually conditional on maintaining attribution in the form of copyright statements of all the previous contributors. And if you haven't got a process to accumulate and automate, well, there is a problem going to be coming for you down the road somewhere. So I recommend that you automate it, that you make your build system fail the build if the license information is incomplete. Make it automatic. Developers fix things that make the build fail. And so use this to your advantage and make sure that the build fails when the license information is wrong. I believe that in this third decade, we're going to rediscover software freedom. See, in the first decade of open source, we tended to treat open source as an amoral methodology. Now, amoral, I have to point out, English word, different from immoral. Okay? Immoral means that it's bad. Amoral means I don't care. In the first decade of open source, we tended to treat open source as a methodology, an approach to building software, and one in which the ethics didn't really matter. The fact it all depended on the ethics was something that we left for conversation later. We renamed that word amoral to pragmatism in the second decade of open source. But in the third decade of open source, we're beginning to discover that we have new problems, like cloud and IoT. And we are beginning to discover that we need to come up with new solutions for them, ways to make sure freedom continues to exist. The way you do that is not by making arbitrary rules, it's by going back to software freedom and saying, how can I make sure this software can be used by the most people most easily? How can I make sure this software can be studied and improved by anyone, wherever they are in the world, whatever business they're in? How can I make sure that this software can be shared with whoever needs it? Because the answers to those questions are typically the ones that help you work out how to do the licensing and distribution of cloud software, or of containers, or, God forbid, of coins. You may be getting my views about Bitcoin here as well, so I should be quiet about that. The other alternative, of course, is to just repeat all the old mistakes again. And OSI, well, I'm with OSI, so I should talk about it. I believe that in the third decade of open source, having in the first decade helped people know what a license was that was open source, and in the second decade, having told people to just calm down and stop writing so many licenses, in the third decade, we're focusing much more on community and authenticity. We want to build bridges between open source communities because we believe that the goodness comes from the connections between people. It's not just the code, it's the community as well that matters. And so OSI is going to focus more and more on communities and authenticity in its future. To support us in doing that, we need you to support the open source charities. There's two kinds of open source entities in the world. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. The Linux Foundation and the OpenStack Foundation and organizations like that are consortia. They are groups of companies that have come together because they have a shared purpose. Whereas OSI and the Free Software Foundation and Free Software Foundation Europe and the Software Freedom Conservancy are charities. We exist purely to serve the public interest. We don't have any requirement to respect the needs of any particular company. And in devising the future for open source, you need to support both of us. Yes, go work on OpenStack, go work on projects in the Linux Foundation, but also contribute to OSI and FSF, contribute to Software Freedom Conservancy, because we're the ones who speak up when something is wrong. And without us, things will go wrong and no one will speak up. So do, please, support us. So that's my summary for you. The third decade. In this decade, code for cloud freedom. Help us to stay free people in the cloud. Create cultures of contribution, because that's what your future career is going to depend on. Get ready for new kinds of compliance in software licensing, particularly attribution, by automating the process of making sure the license information is right. Cherish software freedom and look to it every time you have a new business problem to see whether there's a guide on how to solve the business problem. And cultivate the charities as well as the consortia, because you need both in the world. Software freedom is the essential core of our software future. Without it, we become a world of faceless corporations extracting rent and extracting our private information in order to gain advertising benefit or to sell to surveillance regimes in government. Software freedom keeps us free people with federated systems that we can trust because they belong to us and not to someone else. And the future of software is, the future of software freedom is open source. And the future of open source is software freedom. Those two things are the same thing, talked about to different communities. So please never give in when someone wants to divide open source and free software, because the two communities need each other because they're the same community. And the third decade of open source, by the way, needs young and old to mentor each other. I'm getting quite old now. I use a bit of hair dye, but it's happening. And I can guarantee you that sometime in the next 30 years, I will either retire or die, or both. And I've done quite a few things with software. I open sourced Java. I actually started the Java business at IBM. I open sourced the Java platform. I've been president of the Open Source Initiative for 6 years and working with it for a decade. I can tell you why things happened. I can tell you where the bodies are buried. You want to know those things because if you don't find out, you'll find yourself in the same position in a couple of years' time when the problem comes around again. So mentor an old guy. All the talk is of us old guys mentoring you young things. But do it the other way around. Find an old guy and be a mentor. Extract all that information out of my head before I lose the ability to remember it. And, of course, please join the Open Source Initiative, because we need you globally. It's through your support that I'm able to come and tell you these things and keep the message flowing from generation to generation. Thanks very much.
It turned a bit dramatic towards the end. It was like,
Yeah, the part when he retired.
yeah,
Stuff.
yeah,
Very,
yeah, it's touchy. We have a few questions from you from the audience. The most upvoted ones, we have a full list, so there's a bunch of time to talk about these later.
So this is like Stack Overflow then?
No, it's just
Yeah, kind of, or Reddit if you prefer.
But there's a bunch of them, so you can just go and be mentored
Yeah, I'd like to be
over a beer.
Yeah, over a beer.
So,
With some Speck, maybe.
what is, in your opinion, the main reason why there are still many pieces of proprietary software that don't have proper competitors in the open source world?
Well, it's because there are some things that it's better to do using proprietary software. That sounds like heresy. But if there is a very, very special piece of software that you have that only serves a very few people, the person who writes it needs to eat. And as a hang on. That's it. Good. It's that camera there. I'm very worried about it. So someone's got to eat, and they need paying, and it's very hard to come up with a business model to write the accounting software for a fish shop. Because there aren't very many fish shops. The people who work in them don't write software, and if there's going to be software for them, someone's got to pay the people who write it. So you eventually come down to software that is so specialized that you should consider the software itself to be the service. And in that world where the software is itself the service, then it's appropriate for it to be proprietary. But as we've seen globalization take place, those little markets have gradually become aggregated globally. And so we're seeing more and more software where open source is appropriate. The other thing I'd say is all that software is all built with open source. You know, they've used an open source web framework, or they've used an open source string parsing library, or they've used, you name it, it's all built from open source. It's just the last step of putting the Lego bricks together that is proprietary. And that's why I would say that it's a service rather than a software.
Okay, second question probably. Do you believe GitHub's acquisition from Microsoft will undermine its role as an open source software home?
Well, I have actually an interesting story from that.
Yes.
Can I?
Please do.
So we were at Google Place
Mm-hmm.
with one of the co-founder of Samba, and one of my friends asked to him, what about using GitHub to host the code of Samba? And I don't remember. Jeremy, thank you. And Jeremy was very, very direct on telling me that they shouldn't use GitHub because, you know, from one day to another they could buy GitHub. So next week Microsoft actually bought GitHub. So, well, I think that's pretty on point regarding the position of those kind of companies.
So I look at this and I say, well, you don't have to use GitHub. You can use something else. Sid would love you to use GitLab, for example. However, if we separate out, there's two different questions in there. One of them is, should I be using proprietary cloud services? And my answer to that is, well, what exactly do you mean by a proprietary cloud service? You know, GitHub is built all from open source software. They just haven't made a tarball that's got it all in the configuration that they deploy. So at what point do you stop considering it to be open source? Then there's a second question, which is Microsoft. Microsoft has bought GitHub and the world is ending. I don't think the world is ending. So I've been and had conversations with the, if I say what his job is, you'll know who he is, but with someone who's going to play a very important role at GitHub for Microsoft. And he explained to me that what's happening here is Microsoft is being taken over by a new company. It's like the Tea Party taking over the Republican Party, only better. And what's happening is this new company, this cloud company called Azure, is gradually taking over, and it's all staffed by young people who believe in software freedom. And what's happening is they're paying the bills with all the legacy revenue from Microsoft's dying products, like Microsoft Office and Microsoft Windows, which Microsoft knows have no future beyond, well, you know, the next 7 to 10 years. Microsoft is already trying to sell you desktop in the cloud. They're already trying to sell you Office 365. They know it's dead. And so what they're doing is they're using the money they're getting from that to start up their successor company, which is Azure. Only Azure is a company that is run by people who believe in free software. And so I am actually not too worried about them buying GitHub, because I think they believe more in open source than the people who used to own it did, who I don't think really believe very much in open source software, but probably Zach knows more about that than I do. So I might defer the question to your session. Yeah.
Yeah. We actually have other 16 questions.
Only 16? Okay.
And we can leave for later, but the final one is, are we going to sing the Free Software Sample together?
No.
Okay, and we get applause for him as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I would say it's already quite late. I would say 2 minutes break. At 10:10, we start back again with the second talk by Zach. Yeah?
All right. I mean, if you need it.
Yeah.
She's doing here the filming thing. You say, ficamos. Ficamos quando tu vai ficar. Quer dizer, eu adoro a parte que filmamos. Não, eu posso ficar sem
Grazie Giulio, appena ci siamo.
I like working.
Basta che mi le tieni per
Vocês ficam. Opa, eu provavelmente fazer aos filhos. Não, eu vou também. Já vou ver lá na seca. Agora estão-me a fazer sentir mal. Pode ser a câmera boa, mas...
Allora, vai sulle preferenze. No, vai su preferenze.
Mas a esta hora...
Invia. Invia. L'altra finestra. Vai su, no, torna su. Arrangement. Arrangement. Sì. Capisco, scusami. Allora, aspetta, ci metto.
Yeah.
I'm going with them.
It's just because I don't have keys or anything, so I just have to go with them. But I really
I was going to be.
No, dentro, va.
considering the subject, yeah, considering the subject. So,
Esatto, per quella. Aspetta, vai. Vai.
Are you going this way?
Sta andando. Aprila con... dammi un attimo. Sei sicuro che sia attaccato? Questo se n'è rimasto attaccato. Ah, lì, sì, se puoi staccarlo e riattaccarlo. Se non ci non è che hai girato l'entrata. Franz, fa la luce blu, per fortuna. Vedi adesso c'è. Infatti adesso vuoi andare stagionante? Aspetta, possiamo guadagnarci. No, l'ho appena... non va. Prova. E prima scrollava di là. Non so la ricognita. Non so perché mostrava le mani. No, sì, questo.
No, ma sai che c'è la batteria? Come l'altro.
Ma vai.
No, ma sì, lo trovo là, c'è che la batteria del corpo.
Partiamo direi.
Hello, we start back. The other we start the early with the food.
Vediamo qui.
Ah, perfetto. Hai aperto il microfono dopo. Ah, perfetto.
Speriamo il 35. Speriamo il 35.
Oh, we starting. Please come in.
E dallo staff di Speck&Tech, se qualcuno può venire a tenere un attimo direzionate le riprese della live che sta andando ai cani, se no.
Dici?
Dell'acqua, chiedo. Io. Col manigliotto. Giro verso di me? Ma no, è che prende tutti. Ok. Prima sono stato là io. So, while we wait from Francesco, I will interview about random stuff that no one cares about.
Go ahead.
Is this your first time in Trento?
No.
Ah.
And the mountaineer, I was a long
Do you
time
like,
mountaineer.
do you like
Yeah.
the city?
It's been a while since I've been here last time, like maybe 10 years or something.
10 years?
Yeah.
Huh.
It's changed quite a bit.
What's
The whole region here didn't exist.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. What's the weather like in Paris in those days?
Better than here.
Really?
Like 26 or something.
What? Is it summer in Paris or?
No, it's just Weird.
Weird.
Usually it's October all the year. Anyway.
Do you have any other random question while we wait from the front rows?
No, I was trying to troll Simon about something, but nothing comes to mind. But he did manage to embarrass me, so that's...
Yeah, it's actually very English.
Ask me anything. Let's do an email. Okay, you want to say hi from a friend or something? Yes, Napo.
Salutiamo Napo da casa che
We use
sicuramente
like
starà guardando.
training volleyball, right? Training
Dove
some
non
volleyball
c'è internet
match.
notoriamente, ma sì. No, per scherzare.
What are we waiting for?
Francesco, actually. But I think that at this point we can just start and
I was just checking
forget
because
about
I guess the people outside are taking a group picture, so that's why the first rows are totally empty. I guess we can start and then we see.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, cool. I would say I leave the word to you.
Okay.
I think this was an introduction, so
That was very good introduction, thanks.
as welcome our next guest.
Julio.
So I'm not the next guest. It's not an introduction of me.
Too many beers.
Yeah, definitely. So a big warm applause to Stefano. Thank you for being here tonight with us.
Thanks. So just for the records, Simon did manage to embarrass me, but I'm here not to talk about Debian or about any of the stuff I've been doing in the past, but talk about a project called Software Heritage, which is actually quite related to what Simon was talking about. So let's start from an observation that actually Simon already made, but which I'm just picking it up and continue from there. So free software, or open source, I usually use free software, but take your pick, I agree with Simon that they are basically the same, is actually that you find in everything you do in your lives today. So every time you use an electronic device, computing device, something that contains some lines of software, the chances are that it will also contain some free software code. Okay? It's not entirely free software itself, so it doesn't guarantee you freedoms in its entirety, as one of the questions before pointed out, but it contains some lines of source code. You pay your taxes, you drive a car, you use your phone, of course, use your watch, it will contain some free software in there. So why does this matter? Because we usually think, especially if we are tech people, that software is just for making computers do stuff for us. We only think that if you want the functional part of software, it makes machine work for us in automated and wonderful ways. But there's something else in software. Specifically, if you think at source code is something which is made for humans. It's not something that is made for machines, right? Usually you have some different form of software that are run directly by machine. Software source code is for humans. And in software source code, you find knowledge, okay? If you think at scientific papers, scientists publish stuff, actually they discover something new, and they write a paper, and they tell the world about it. Well, you can have the same level of knowledge and innovation in a piece of source code. I have a couple of examples here. One is from Quake 3, and I guess it's an ancient game by today's standards. But when it was released, it contains an algorithm capable of doing rendering of 3D sprites, if you want, in very efficient ways that were not known at the time. Okay? So even if you don't play the game, even if you don't even compile the game, you look at this piece of source code and you will find a novel way to do something that wasn't known before. We have plenty of other examples like that in the Linux kernel. Okay? In the Linux kernel, you have tons of heuristics for doing routing of network packets in a very efficient way that were not known before and would have deserved a scientific publication. So you don't run the Linux kernel, that's fine. If you do understand software, or if you have to know something that understands software, that person can look at a piece of source code and learn something new, at least new at a time. So essentially, the point I'm making here is that every time someone publishes even a single line of software source code and makes it freely available, well, that person is contributing to a kind of commons. So the commons are what in Italian we call beni comuni. So there are resources that are shared in the interest of anyone and are not actually controlled or held by any individual or any corporation. And there are some new kinds of commons that we are making in this digital world, which are digital commons, and specifically there is a thing called the software commons, which is the body of software that anyone can freely use, modify, and redistribute. Well, and if you've paid attention to Simon's talk, well, you know that it's pretty much the definition of free software and open source. Okay, so every time you publish a line of code on the internet, well, you're contributing, you're making something, you're creating a new piece of information, a new piece of knowledge that goes and increases this global amount of knowledge that we collectively share. in a sense, is your legacy. It's something that you are publishing for future generation to exploit and benefit from. So if this is true, so if you agree that every line of code which is published is actually precious and important, it's actually legitimate to ask, are we taking good care of it? Pretty much of how we ask, maybe not often enough, but are we taking good care of the air, of the planet, of the consumption of soil, and so on and so forth. So let's ask this question. Are we taking good care of the software commons? Well, there are reasons to be concerned. First observation is that if this body of knowledge is so important, do we have a place where we go and can look for stuff in it, do searches, okay? Do we have a library where we go and can, do a grep or a search for metadata or whatever you like for all the source code that has been published? As it happens, no, we don't have that yet. You have a myriad of different places where developers do different things. They develop on some places, these days mostly GitHub, if you are old enough to remember SourceForge or FreshMeat or different places, or distribution places. You have places where you distribute software directly to users, like app stores or package managers. But we don't have a single place where we can go and search for source code and actually monitor its evolution over time. Second observation is that software, as pretty much any kind of digital information, is actually pretty fragile. Okay? For a bunch of reasons, if you've been in the tech industry for a while, you have noticed places disappearing. Okay? You might remember stuff like CodeSpace, which is a private hosting company that's been attacked by some cracker and has been essentially shut down because they didn't want to pay a kind of a ransom scheme. You might remember projects like Gitorius or Google Code, which used to exist and then for entirely legitimate business reasons actually do not exist anymore. Gitorius has been acquired by GitLab. Google Code has been shut down by Google because they understood they couldn't make money out of it. But so entirely legitimate reasons, but those hosting places do not exist anymore. Okay? For some of them you have archives, for some of them you have ways of downloading, for instance, a tarball snapshot of the last version of the code there, but you have no way to go back in time and retrieve all the version of the source code that was developed there. So essentially, we have the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machines for stuff like the archival of websites. We do not have something similar if a specific repository you care about disappears from GitHub or GitLab, or, for what it's worth, if the entire service decides to disappear one day from another. And third observation, so my actually day job is being a scientist, so I'm actually very envious of my friends, physicists, who are really good at pooling huge amount of resources for creating amazing infrastructure for research. Since things of the LHC in Geneva or the very large telescope in the Atacama Desert, they've been able to actually pool together a huge amount of resources, create those places, which are not privately owned. Usually they're not even owned by a single state. They're usually international agreements, and this infrastructure remain there. Scientists who want to make experiment go there, pay a small fee, or well, small depends I guess on the kind of infrastructure, but pay a fee related to their experiment, and when they're done, someone else can do the same and participate in maintaining the infrastructure. So as a scientist, I actually dream of a place where I can go, do an experiment, test a theory on the entire body of source code that has ever been published, pay something for maintaining the infrastructure going, test if my theory is true or not, and then go do something else while other researchers use that infrastructure. I would like to have that thing available, connected to the entire software commons. And these reasons are why now, I guess 3 years ago, we announced it 2 years ago, we created this project called Software Heritage. So the goal of Software Heritage is collecting, preserving, and sharing the entire body of software source code which is publicly available. Okay? So it's actually three things. Collecting means going and actually finding it, where it is published. Preserving means preserving it in the very long term. And sharing means making it available and accessible to anyone. So it's not only collecting it, to put behind some locked doors, but actually collecting it and preserving it and giving it available to everyone who actually needs or just wants to have a look at it. So the reason we are doing that is actually to serve different use cases. So the first use case is something I've already mentioned. It's actually cultural heritage. We believe that in software source code, there is knowledge that humans have produced that is part of the legacy of the humankind, and we want to avoid losing it. So, in a sense, this is source code preservation for preservation's sake. It's part of our culture, we should not lose it. A second use case I briefly mentioned too is actually research. Okay? So we want to enable researchers to actually do stuff and avoiding that everyone, every small team of researchers, redo and do their crawling, they do their sampling of GitHub or whatever is popular at the time, to test their experiment on a data set which is big, which is a very large coverage of source code, and it's actually the same for everyone. It also helps with scientific reproducibility to be able to run different experiments on the same data set. But there are two other use cases. So one is in industrial needs. Okay? Essentially, given you have pieces of free software in every IT object that's available on the market today, you also have many different variants of the same library of the same components. So companies can take, or any developer can take components, embed them, but usually they do some modification here and there. So essentially we have a myriad of different variations of the same library embedded in different products. So how do you track which version you have put there? And that's something which is very tough. In the physical world, things that you put in your product have essentially serial numbers, but we don't have the equivalent of serial numbers for software components. You have versions, but then those are not really good enough because maybe developers reuse version numbers, or maybe your developers in-house take a specific version of a component and modified it, but didn't update the version number, right? So we don't have this kind of tracking, and we can enable that. And finally, there are interesting use cases, and again, as a researcher and as a teacher of computer science, I'm kind of sad that we're not very good at using software ontologies to teach computer science to students. If you go and look at other disciplines, they're very good at having corpuses that are used for actually teaching how the evolution of something they do in their discipline evolved over time. I'd like to have the same thing for actually teaching algorithms or more generally a lot of different aspects of computer science. So this is a challenging mission, and our goal is actually to build only this building block of preservation. Okay? The use cases will not something that we will actually implement ourselves. We want to enable all the use cases in creating this single infrastructure which is shared by all the users of the different use cases. So it's a challenge. It's a challenging mission, as I'm going to show you, and we are trying to make our best and making some design decision that maximizes the chances of succeeding. And some of the design decisions we are making is that essentially we want to be entirely open in how we do things. So that means that all the software we write ourselves for software heritage is in itself free software. So that others can go and look at what we're doing, point out bugs, help us in development, and actually it also provides some accountability on the way we're doing things, given the mission is that important. And second, we want to be transparent in how we do things. So essentially we are following all the best practice we have learned from now 2 decades of open source development, and actually public development, public decision-making processes, open backtracking, and so on and so forth. You know that part already. And also, at the business, with quotes, level, we want this to be an entirely non-profit and actually a charity, specifically, initiative. Not because companies are bad or anything, but because the goals of companies can change actually rather quickly if you look at the long term. They can be bought by other companies that have different goals, or they might have to change their strategies over time for specific profit-related reasons. So we are creating this project, and there are a non-profit corporation, and a non-profit charity, which is entirely driven only by the mission of source code preservation. So let's dig down into some of the details here. So what are we doing exactly? So we are archiving all the source code we can find together with its development history, as it is captured by version control system. So we want to make developers capable of going back to a point in time in development of their project, where they have everything that happened till that time in their version control system. Okay? That means that we have some places that we crawl, essentially, that we know are places where the source code is either developed or distributed. Okay? And from there, we crawl in depth, those distribution places, and we archive stuff like the content of the file. So essentially we take all the content of the files we can find in a version control system and we archive it all. Not only the latest version we can find there, we go back in history of the version control system and archive all of it. Of course, we archive specific revisions. So every commit we can find, we archive it together with all the metadata. So we archive who has done a commit, when, what was the name, what was the commit message, and what was the structure of the revision history at that point in time. And we also archive all, essentially, the coding information. So we note down when and where we've found all that stuff. And we do that using a data model which is canonical. So we just don't run a bunch of git clone or sven checkout, okay? we have created a data model in which you can store in a uniform way stuff that comes from Git, from Subversion, from CVS, from a Debian source package, from a tarball, for you name it. Okay? So stuff that is archived and distributed in different formats will all essentially be merged in a single data model. And what we do not archive, just to be clear on our mission, is everything which is outside your version control system, basically. So we do not archive backtracking system, we do not archive discussions on mailing lists, code reviews history, websites, and that kind of stuff. Not because they are not important, they are very important, especially if from a, say, museum or historical point of view, you want to reconstruct the feeling or the kind of community that existed around the project at the time. That stuff is really important. But we do not want to, fall victims of mission creep. We want to stay focused on a single mission, and maybe the day we have succeeded at doing that, we will try to do more. So, in terms of architecture, we are basically like a search engine. So we crawl, not all the web, but we start from specific places. So we have a list of starting points that can be forges, or they can be package managers, package manager repositories, sorry. And periodically, we crawl those places using software components that we call listers. So one kind of listers exists for any different kind of distribution place. So we have one lister for GitHub, for instance. We have one lister for GitLab that can be used for all the GitLab instances out there. We have one lister for the Debian repository, okay? And periodically, we run those, and we find all the packages or all the repositories that are listed there. There is some intelligence here to avoid recalling too frequently stuff that is not updated that much. So we do a typical exponential fallback. So if we have seen changes, we increase the frequency. If we have not seen changes, we decrease the frequency so that eventually it will adapt and remain at a steady state. And what we find, we put them in essentially a list of what we call software origins, which are, again, stuff that we crawl with component called loaders. And there we have one loader for every different type of, essentially, source code distribution mechanism. One for Git, one for Subversion, one for Debian source packages, and so on and so forth. And there too, for any software origins that we have listed, periodically we do the same game. So we go there, see if there is new stuff, and if there is new stuff, archive it, with the same intelligence and being adaptive about the amount of changes we see. And what's interesting here is that we deduplicate everything. So the actual archive is something where everything is stored only once. So if we see the same file content 1 gazillion times, it gets stored only once. Okay? But it's more than that. If we see the same commit 1 gazillion times, we store it only once. The same directory, and so on and so forth. Essentially, it's a data model which is maximized for reducing storage space and be scalable and affordable in the very long term of archival. And what is this data model? So essentially a big graph, which is a Merkle DAG. So I guess we cannot see a lot of details in this with this resolution, but essentially it's the data structure itself, what we call a Merkle DAG. So it's a DAG structure, Merkle structure is a data structure which is used very commonly in stuff like Git itself, in blockchains. Essentially a tree-like or a DAG-like structure in which each node has a cryptographic identifier which is extracted, which is computed using the content of the node. So the leaves of this graph are essentially the content of the files. So the identifiers of the files, of the content of the files itself is just a cryptographic checksum of the content of the file. So we find a new file, something which we think is a new file content. We compute a cryptographic hash. We see if it's already there. If it's already there, we do not store it anymore. If it's not there, we will store it. And we go up and do the same for directories, for commits, for releases, up to what we call snapshots, which are essentially kind of pictures we take of a specific version control system repository. So for instance, for a Git repository, we can take a picture and say, we have found a list of branches, each branch points to this object, and we take a snapshot, checksum of all of that, and we see if we have already seen that picture of the repository. And if we have already seen it, we do nothing. If we have never seen it, we go down and see what we have to archive. So that means that even if you delete a repository, or even if you do some destructive change to the repository, like rewriting the history of modifying a branch, well, we still have the old picture we took of your repository, and we can still reconstruct the state of your repository at any point in time. So this is actually not a theory, something that exists for real. It's been going on for quite a while. These are some figures of how much stuff we have archived up to now. You will find more detailed figures on our website. So we have archived more than 5 billion source files, and note that those are unique source files because everything is duplicated. So that means we have more than 5 billion different file contents archived already. We have archived more than 1 billion commits, again, unique commits. So every commit that is there is different from other. And all that stuff comes from more than 80 million. It's written projects, so it depends on the kind of origin we have archived, right? So if it is something like GitHub, we have one project for each repository. If it is something like Debian, we have one project for each package, okay? But that's a significant coverage. So we still claim this is the largest existing source code archive in the world, and we have never been called out on that, so it's probably true. We are not aware of any project that's archived more source code related artifacts than us. So what do we have as data sources? So we have live GitHub, so we have a live mirror of GitHub itself. We have GitLab, the main instance, plus a couple of instances, like for instance, we have the INRIA's GitLab scientific archive. We are adding more. We have Debian, archived periodically. We have PyPy. We have done one-off ingestion of stuff that has been essentially disappearing over time. So we have archived all of Gitorius before it was taken down in collaboration with the Internet Archive. Same for Google Code in collaboration with Google. And we've done a one-off ingestion of the GNU Turbo releases. We're working on Bitbucket and more stuff that we're going to mention later. As a dataset itself, it's big, but not that big. So, as you can imagine, this space is taken by the file contents, and that's something south of 200 terabytes. Okay? I'm saying it's not that big because if you compare with stuff like YouTube or more generally videos of cats, that's nothing, right? But in terms of software source code, it's pretty significant. The rest of the data model is currently implemented using standard SQL databases. It's a PostgreSDB, which is something like 6 terabytes. Okay, but just an implementation detail. You can implement the same data model using different technologies. And if you are curious of the size as a graph, well, that's a pretty significant graph. It's 10 billion, it has 10 billion nodes and more than 100 billion edges. So it's way past the state of the art of industry-grade graph databases, and requires some care to be manipulated properly. So what can you do with that? So you can use it in various ways. So there is a web API, okay? Essentially, if you want to just navigate through the graph, you have a REST-like API that you can find at that address with a full list of the endpoints available there. And using that API, you cannot do mass data analysis because we don't have the infrastructure for doing that yet. But essentially, you can say, hey, do you have this repository or this package I care about? We will tell you if we have it or not. You can ask for the full list of crawling we have done of that repository. If you're familiar with the Wayback Machine of the Internet Archive, it's pretty similar. It will just give a time-stamped list of all the visits we have done of that repository. You pick a visit, and you will see which picture, so the snapshot we had, and you can drill down. You can find where each branch was pointing at the time, drill down to directory, go down at some point, drill down to revision, then directory, and then you will arrive at the content of the files, and you will be able to retrieve the content of the files. Also, you can actually download stuff. Okay, that's the main use case, right? And essentially, downloading stuff means reconstructing a part of the graph that you care about. Can be a directory. For instance, I wanted to have a checkout of a specific directory at the time of a specific commit. Or you might want to have the full repository because the repository has gone and you don't have a copy. So for that, we have a service that is called the Software Heritage Vault, which is an asynchronous service in which you will say, okay, I want to reconstruct this. Can you give me a copy? And you click on a button, we start reconstructing in the background. You will get a notification either via the web app or via email about when the archive is ready, and you will be able to download it. And you can download it usually either as a tarball, if you just want a directory, or if you want something more, if you want an history, we offer download in a Git bundle format, which is something that you can, it's a single file that contains the entire structure of a repository, which you can then Git clone from and obtain a Git repository on your disk. And also, you can play with that on your browser. So essentially, equivalent to the web API, you have a proper web user interface, which is very similar to the Wayback Machine. So you can search on the Origins Web Archive, you will get a nice calendar, pick a visit, and you will essentially have a repository navigation tool, which is not the repository like it is today, it is a repository as it was at the time we archived it. Okay? So it looks like GitHub, but you're going back in time at the state of the repository at the time. I'm guessing I won't have much time for going through this case study, so I will leave for you on the slide actually. So it will show you how we have archived PyPy. Okay, so the technical steps of what we need to do to create the software components needed to archive a new source. So if you care about, I don't know, NPM or Maven or whatever, with this case study we show you what we have done to archive PyPy, and you can actually help us and do the same for other software components. So I'll skip the deck bits and let's go from here. So how can you help? So we have a roadmap, we have a technical roadmap, right? So we've already done quite a few things, okay? So we have done lookup by content hash, we have done the Wayback Machine of sort that you can use either via the API or via the web user interface. We are working on a couple of pretty cool features. So one, we're working with Open Access Archive for Science. So essentially, scientists often deposit open access papers about their work, okay, so that everyone can access the paper, but very rarely deposit the source code that goes with the paper that will allow you to check or redo the experiment on similar data. So we're working with some of those open access archive to allow researchers to also deposit the source code associated with their experiment and automatically archive it. So we have already done that with HAL, H&L, which is the biggest scientific open access repository in France. So actually, researcher can do that now, and we will archive it, the source code for posterity. And we're also adding a Save Code Now feature. So if you go on our web UI, it's not announced publicly yet, but it actually already works. So you can just drop us a URI of a Subversion or a Git or a molecular repository, and we will add it to our high priority list of repositories to archive, and you can monitor when we have archived it and actually see that it's been added to the archive. We're already working on the download stuff, which I've already mentioned. And the next two big things we're working on is actually provenance lookup, so letting people know, doing reverse lookups in the graph itself. So for instance, letting people know, tell me all the places where you have seen those files or those comments. Or, more interesting for prior art stuff, tell me the first place where you have seen this specific source code file or this specific comment. Because that can help you in various ways determining who is the legitimate copyright holder of some piece of code, or even who is the most authoritative person if I need help on that specific software component. Okay? And of course, you can imagine all sorts of full text search or machine learning on the content of the files. It's a significant data set, so we're just getting started on this kind of stuff, but that's what's next in line for us in terms of work. Essentially, what we have here is a unified view of the public development of software that is going on. Okay? So essentially, you can imagine a lot of features on top of that, and we're actually working on it. So how can you help? So all the software we developed ourselves is free software itself. It's not on GitHub. It's from our own Forge, which is a Fabricator instance. And we have a bunch of developer documentation, which is showing where we're going and the API documentation and so on and so forth. So there are a bunch of stuff to be done on the web UI itself. So we just have we're not that big, so we are a dozen of people working on that. So we have essentially a single web developer who is working on the web UI, so your help is very welcome on that. And of course, we're working a lot on increasing the coverage of the archive. So we started with the big ones because that's what you need to go after to create a bigger archive. But there are a lot of low-hanging fruits to be had. For instance, RPM source packages, NPM, something I've already mentioned. There are a bunch of package managers for all different sort of languages, Cargo for Rust, or you name it. So if there is a single community or single ecosystem that we have not archived yet, except tangentially because they are also on GitHub probably, well, come and help us an example for that. If you're not a developer, you can of course help in other ways. So of course raising awareness is something that is always much needed. So letting others know about the project itself. something that makes us very happy, and also helping us in figuring out what is in need of being archived. So essentially we have a wiki page in which people that know that specific source code distribution places or specific forages are going to be taken down, well, we want to know before they actually are taken down so that we can increase the priority of archiving them and archiving them before it's too late. We have a small team, but we have frequently some jobs opening, so not right now, but something that you are interested in working with us, you can keep an eye on. And if you're a student, we have internships. There are a bunch of research-related and very practical questions here as to what we're doing, and we periodically have internship in France, so we are based in Paris. We are entirely English-speaking, so all development is happening in English, on the forge, on the chat, and so on and so forth, but we are based in Paris, so if you're interested in internship in France and Paris, let me know. And to conclude, so essentially what we are doing is a reference archive of all free software that has ever been written. The idea is giving you a single place where you can find all of that. All of that is being done by a non-profit organization which is trying to create a mutualized infrastructure. Mutualized meaning that it's built once, but for the benefit of all of us. It's something you can use today, okay? Either if you're a developer or if you want your code to be sure your code is archived, something you can actually use. And the idea is something which is at the service of our community, actually to preserve our lands. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stefano. It's a quite a fascinating project.
Yes. We have some questions for you from the audience. First one, where are you hosting all this stuff?
Okay, good one. So we have several copies. Of course, because with a single copy you have no hope that it's never going to disappear. So right now we're running 2 copies. One is on-premise. So the main sponsor of the project is INRIA. That is a French university research institution. Basically, it's the largest research center for computer science in France. And we have 1 copy on-premise. And the second copy is being hosted on Azure. Microsoft is one of the sponsors. We have a bunch of different corporate sponsors. And so we have a second copy running on their cloud. Also, we are creating a mirror program in which everyone with enough data in space to actually archive the same data can actually participate. And I make a different distinction here between a mirror and a copy, because a copy is something we run ourselves. So even if writes are not synchronized, we have the technical power of deleting both copies at the same time. And that's not good, right? And so the idea with the mirror would be run independently and under different responsibility, even from the point of view of management. So we need coordinated action by several different actors to actually lose all of this.
We keep gathering proof that Micro is not evil anymore. I'm so puzzled about this. What do you have?
We have a bunch of other corporate sponsors, but for now they're the only additional.
How many metrics do you collect? How and which tools do you use?
Metrics for which kind of?
Repeat the question.
I think like how many downloads, that kind of stuff, I guess.
So we have the data about, so in terms of how much we are ingesting in the archive, we have essentially metrics for any different type of object. So I've shown you just a few in the slide, but if you go on our archive page, you will see the ratio of rows of files, commits, directories, releases, snapshots, and so on. All of that is monitored. While if the question is people downloading, we have them, we haven't yet crunched it. But I'm not too shocked by the fact that maybe in terms of download is not being used much yet, because an archive is useful when you lose something, right? So what we expect is that maybe the day GitHub disappears or the day something is taken down, we will see a peak of traffic in downloading stuff, and then we'll go back to essentially steady state. That's what we're expecting.
All right.
There's a question which is, what if some of the repositories contain the personal data, e.g. someone committed a data set? Do you already have an experience handling this in terms of GDPR?
So we don't have practical experience yet, but we're ready. So essentially, of course, we are abiding to whole laws that applies in France. So we are ready to have, DMCA takedown notice or GDPR reduction notices. And the idea is that essentially, when we can, we will just hide the copy and make it impossible for it to be downloaded any further. And if you are forced to delete it, well, we will be forced to delete it. I personally consider that overreaching copyright rules are kind of a threat to long-term preservation. So the idea of mirrors is to have mirrors also under different jurisdictions around the world. So maybe you will be forced to delete one copy from some place, but you can keep a copy in a different place around the world.
Cool. There's a bunch of other questions, but I guess we can leave it up to the networking part.
Yeah, you can find Stefano, and if it's before like
Sure.
the third or fourth beer, he would answer. Otherwise, he would just laugh at you, I hope. And
I can do Italian, French, English, and Bolognese dialect. If you
Yeah.
want.
I was hoping for a dialect, thank you.
And just before closing, I would say we also have to thank Alberto Montresor for the introduction to Stefano, for sending a private email. So big applause again to
Cheers.
you for this.
You're bigger than Speck&Tech. This approach is used, so thank you very much.
Cool.
All right, so I would like also to personally salute Gadotti, which was live from Facebook. If you
Weird.
still live.
The next festival.
Sorry, this is personal. All right, so thank you everybody for the wonderful night and the wonderful speaker. You've been truly awesome. The talks were very good, and I believe that open source is still relevant. I've been it's very relevant.
It's extremely relevant.
I didn't listen to the talk, obviously, that's why I'm speaking this. Sorry, I don't speak English, yes, as well. The cat is on the table. Really, one thing that I would like to say in conclusion is, we also covered a little bit of this during the retreat, and I personally covered this deeply with Simon in Silicon Valley. I have the privilege of going there. And what I personally think is that it's not something that you learn from school, it's not something that you learn until you crash your face against it. As Simon said, there have been errors that have already been made in the past, and I'm really happy that we share this all together tonight. Also because a lot of you are young from university, I am young as well. Sorry. You know, just chronological thing.
Everybody's young. You're only old when you think you are.
All right, so yeah, I'm really happy that we hosted this event, and this is like really important things, and that's the power of Speck&Tech. So everybody, thank you very much for making this possible.
And just before closing, some logistical details. So we will move this thing here, and can you take care of the plant, actually?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so we'll move this in here, so you get always the same thing, you know, you get the chairs, you stack them here on this side, in the middle we'll bring the beer and the spec in, and the chairs go out, so
just stack the chairs, help Speck&Tech.
Thank you.
Every one of you, thank you very much.
Hey! Ho dovuto skippare i dettagli tecnici perché non ci avrei mai...